Your shelves are overflowing with forgotten pottery. Your inbox is full of, "Is my piece ready yet?" And somehow you've spent 2 hours today trying to track down membership and firing fee payments. If you're managing a community pottery studio, this probably sounds a little too familiar. Kiln Fire helps studios simplify all of this. From class bookings to payments, piece tracking, wheel reservations, pickup alerts, and more. All in one place. Less admin, more clay. Learn more at kilnfire.com.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. As a proud sponsor of this episode, we are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs by providing the best customer service and world-class workshops. Join us this summer for a glaze mixing workshop with our very own low-fire expert, Ben Carter, July 24th through the 26th. Visit cornellstudiosupply.com to sign up. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection features photos of 4,500 objects made by over 1,250 artists. Each object has at least 3 high-quality images that can be downloaded and used with no permission required, making them a great source of inspiration for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 571 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Greenhalgh and Stephanie Rozene about their new podcast, The History of Ceramics. In our interview, we discuss Adelaide Alsop Robineau's life and her masterwork, the Scarab Vase, along with how her generation helped create the studio pottery movement in the United States. The podcast is available from your favorite podcast player, but I also recommend that you check it out on YouTube or Heni Talks, where you'll be able to see video with images of the work discussed in each episode. Before we get to this episode, I also wanted to mention that I'm going to be out in Dayton, Ohio at Cornell Studio Supply teaching a low-fire glaze mixing workshop. We're going to be doing the whole spectrum, everything from gloop glazes to traditional glazes, as well as firing a rocket kiln, and we're going to do a low-fire soda in a rocket kiln. So if you'd like to be a part of that hands-on workshop, you can join us July the 24th through the 26th. There'll be a link in the show notes to that, but you can also check out cornellstudiosupply.com for more information on how to register. Also wanted to take a minute and plug the Tales from the Vault podcast feed. This is an exclusive perk of Patreon supporters for this show. If you make a donation, you will gain access to dozens of episodes that are no longer available on major podcast apps. I just recently remastered a couple episodes that are up on the Tales from the Vault feed, including a live show we did back at the Belger Arts Center back in 2013, as well as an interview with James Beard Award-winning chef Paul Berglund. If you'd like to check those out, you can make a donation and get access to that today at patreon.com/redclayrambler. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. I wanted for you both to introduce yourselves and also to say how you define yourselves, because you both do so many different things. So, Stephanie, can you start and give an introduction for yourself?
I'm a maker and I'm a professor of ceramic art. I teach at a small liberal arts institution called Hartwick College in upstate New York. I've been teaching for almost 25 years, so that is certainly really central to who I am as a maker, as well as a teacher. I make work that is rooted in ceramic history in a lot of different ways, from 18th century courts of France and the porcelain used by Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette from the Sèvres manufactory, to a body of work that is rooted in the history of clay and cooking pots from Mexico. So my practice has always been really deeply connected to history. That history is connected to my classroom, the making, the teaching, the constant sort of learning is a thing that is I find really cyclical. Um, yeah, I'm also a podcaster now, and that's a kind of a new thing to say. Which I think is again, it's really connected to the teaching and to the making and the thinking. I serve on the board of trustees at Watershed Center for Ceramic Arts. I'm the president-elect of the board. I'm currently in a vice presidency role. And I think staying connected to the broader national field has it's really helped support my career and my connective tissue with other makers outside of this small institution that I work with, and I teach at. And working with Paul on this podcast project has like expanded my international connections. We're both members of the International Academy of Ceramics as well. So there's a connective tissue there. I think that at the core of it is about always wanting to learn new things, really interested in the history of ceramics and its ability to tell the story of humanity. And how do we teach those things to new generations?
I always start by saying I played football for England for a long time, but that would just be, a lie, really, I think. I trained originally as a painter and then transitioned into being an art historian. I studied at the Courtauld Institute, which is a major art history centre in London. And most of my career has been split between museums and art schools, I would say. So I've always wanted to be near practice or near the objects as a historian. But I suppose as a historian, a lot of my work is really contextual. Like I've written a lot on the history of exhibitions and on the role of the visual arts in society. So having trained as a painter and deeply love painting and done and published something on it, I moved over into the decorative arts, design and architecture, i.e. those arts which interface with society more intimately. And ceramic is the single greatest art for that, because you can get a nice pot, well, perhaps not a nice pot in a dollar store, but you can also pay tens of millions of dollars for a pot. In other words, it goes through all the social classes, it goes through all the economic classes, it goes through most countries where they've got clay, and it goes back through time. So it's ubiquitous, and it allows you to think about civilization. And hence the book I did on the history of ceramics, civilization is the major word in a way. It's a route into society, and I think that's what makes it so very magical. In a broader sense, I'm really a specialist historian of perhaps 1850 to 1940, which I would see as the pioneer modernist period, when the arts as we have them were pretty much formed, I would say, especially the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, which is the period of Art Nouveau, which is something I've been used to as well. So I've splashed around quite a lot, but I would say a common thread through all those decades was ceramic. My very first job at Cardiff Art School in Wales, at a time when they had a very major ceramic programme, one of the lead ones in the country, in the British Isles. Wales is a country, of course, and it was certainly the best one there. And one realised that we were shoving all the ceramic students into the classes on painting or design. and that there was a general sense that there's no such thing as ceramic history in the modern sense of a structured history that's been written and that has its own theory and its own outlook, not something tagged on to other histories. And that became an interest. And with the great legendary potter Mick Casson, who's one of the big figures of British art. I suppose he's was British equivalent of Warren Mackenzie or a figure like that, a grand teacherly potter. And Mick and I wrote what we thought at the time was the first undergraduate program in the history of ceramics to be taught to the students. And that's really where I started in my early 20s and then went on. I remember my thesis was on Georges Braque, the painter at the Court Order, and the influence of classical ceramics on Braque. Braque loved ceramics, as did Picasso. And I said to Mick Casson, look, I can do the ancient Greeks and I can do Georges Braque. If you could do the bit in the middle, then we're good.
It's a small bit.
Mick just squeezed in the 2,000 years of ceramic history. But one obsessed. I mean, wherever you go, there's great ceramic. And it's a magical art, of course, and it's the one that we're emotionally engaged with as well. So, and it's an art that everybody can have at some level, unself-consciously so. So that's kind of what I do, a mixture of museums and colleges, I suppose.
Well, this is actually what I wanted to start with, kind of the conversation you had about Mick squeezing all of this history into one thing. You're producing a podcast in which you're attempting to squeeze thousands of years of history into bite-sized, accessible chunks. So can y'all talk about how you have given the bigger series structure? Because like Big H history is very huge, but you guys are making it personal. You're telling personal stories. So how did you do that?
I will say, I think we have a really great production team. It's not just Paul and I. We have a wonderful art historian who's helping us with research. We have a producer, we have an editor, and our executive producer worked at BBC for a long time. And she's really good at telling human stories. And Paul and I are really good at telling academic stories. So I think that she helps kind of bring the human story to light. And when we ask our researcher to bring stories for us, we ask her to specifically find the human stories so that we can layer in our academic knowledge to link these histories to people and to the time in which they lived and the impact that ceramics had on their existence. It's been a different approach for, I think, both Paul and I of how we get at that and what we bring forward. I think we both feel like there's certain stories that have to come sort of first in a way so that we can build on broader histories, but we're kind of laser focused on making sure this thing is global and that it jumps around the timeline, and you can't do that in one episode. So we've just sort of committed to maybe thinking about there's 3 different types of stories we're telling. There are like individual biopics, right? Like the episode on Adelaide Alsop Robineau. Then there's we did a 2-part series on the like European porcelain fever and the discovery of the recipe for porcelain in Meissen. So there's some that are going to be multi-part to tell a broader story. And then there are others that are going to be cultural that we come back to. We're going to come back to China time and time again. We're going to come, we're working on this beginning of 2 parts that will be Mesoamerica. So we're starting with Maya and the Aztecs. We're working up episodes on Islam and Iznik and Ottoman. And so we're trying to make sure that we hit all of these cultures, but we can't possibly tell the story of ceramics of China in 45 minutes. So we've decided to sort of chunk it out into topics or cultures or stories where we can identify by people.
I would say also, For me, I'm very interested in what I would call historiography. How does history flow, and what are the motor forces and behind? And I mean, ceramic is interesting because it goes in cultures. One of the most staggering things I always find with things like ancient Greek ceramic is how far that look spread through the ancient world and then through time. When you boil it back down, it was a handful of potters in a number of studios that were, the studio area probably was like 4 tennis courts. And they made an approach to ceramic that transformed the ancient world. And so it goes from the individual to the cultural, and those styles which bite and which survive and those which don't, and are very, very interesting. So I think one of the threads is the individuals making this stuff and what their status was, the value of this stuff, value both in what was its status from time to time, but also what did it actually cost to acquire a pot in ancient Greece, for example, or in Islamic Lebanon or whatever. So there are a number of threads which I think we would find interesting now, things that actually impinge on our lives. And we're well aware that, America is typified by so many extraordinary things, but America is also 315 million individuals, and for me, the tension between the two is very interesting. So biographies, cultures. It's great that Stephanie has technical knowledge of the yin yang, and can correct me whenever I get it wrong, which is very good. And I'm not quite sure what I bring to the party, but I think
come now.
it's this historiography of what's the status of this thing at this time. The world record so far, somebody paid $243 million for a Ming Dynasty pot in 2018. So that's going some. And as I say, you can get a pot in the dollar store. So status is tremendously interesting. That's what makes ceramic different from gold. You don't get big golden pots in dollar stores.
But I think too, though, the kind of parsing it down into what part do we tell is also this relationship that Paul and I have going sort of back and forth, and we take the research notes and we put it into a script, and and if he's the lead researcher on that episode and I'm interviewing him, we chat multiple times a week, and I ask him to sort of, okay, can you talk me through these notes? So we and then I go back in and kind of tease things, and he goes back in and tease things, so that we can really have a connective kind of arc of like 4 chapters per episode, and what are the key points in each sort of narrative. I mean, even in a biopic, we're not going to be able to tell the entire story of a person, but hopefully we can get folks excited enough to want to go learn more.
Well, we're teaching each other as well as everybody else, aren't we? Which I think is so that hopefully it makes sense not just to our colleagues in the field, and at both professional and at semi-professional and enthusiastic amateur and collectors. The ceramic world is big across the board, but we're also interested in people who've never thought about pots before. And our BBC colleague, Emma, the producer, director, very, very keen on finding angles that will pull people in. Like, for example, Hans Koper and Lucy Ree. We spend all our time here pretending they're British, of course.
But they're not.
But they're not. It's a German and an Austrian who come very powerfully from those 2 cultures. The fact that they had to escape from the Nazis and start from zero, and that she took him in as a kind of big sister, younger brother. I think when we look at their work, it's very abstract work, but at another level, it's work about timelessness and universality. It's anti nationalism. It's anti the individual. It's pro culture as a bigger, timeless thing. And I think surely that is in response to the terrible lives they had themselves early on. And I think that kind of story can help somebody from completely outside of our world to move in and then start to look at the work. So from that perspective, I suppose it's a little bit museum curatorship as well. Of the greatest thing I think in the various museums I've worked in is when you bring people in who don't like museums and who are afraid of museums, and who, if you can get those people to come in and enjoy themselves, to see something that they like, you've won. That's obviously we want our professional colleagues, all our enthusiasts to come in and enjoy, but that magic element of a bigger culture is what the arts can give to the world, I think.
Yeah, and I think we're incredibly lucky. I mean, none of this would be possible without Heni, which is the company that produces this podcast among other podcasts, Brilliant Art Films, which Paul's been involved in. Their publishing house. They published Paul's latest book on Art Nouveau architecture, and they're a gallerist. So the guy who owns Heni, Joe Haig, his whole mission with Heni is to make arts more accessible. I mean, the fact that he came to Paul and says, I want to start a podcast and I want to make one about the history of ceramics, that's pretty incredible. And he's really given us this platform to be able to tell these stories, which is wild and amazing to me that I get to be involved in this project.
We should reemphasize that. It was Joe's idea to do history of ceramic specifically. And at the time when he and I talked, we wanted, should it be a bit wider? Should it, will it work? And it really was Joe's decision and his insistence that I think probably an emotional feeling that the moment had come for ceramic to, of course, I agree with that. And we'll do our very best to kind of take it to as wide a audience as humanly possible. So it's wonderful. It's Joe's brainchild. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to zoom in on someone that you covered in one of the episodes that I think a lot of Americans will know, which is Adelaide Alsop Robineau. Everyone knows the Scarab Vase, or what is the full name?
It is called the Apotheosis of the Toiler.
Exactly. And it's because I
am wearing the Scarface on my... Yes.
This is a good point. Like, it is such a famous object that the Everson Museum uses it to represent the whole museum. But one of the things you did in the episode is you personalized her to me in a way that I haven't had before, and you did it by doing a simple thing. You talked about what it was like when she was a young artist moving to New York City, living by herself, and wanting to be an artist. And I think you guys even found that she was listed in the phone book.
Yeah, when she was living in Syracuse, she was listed as Addie B. Alsop, artist.
Right. So, yes, exactly. So it was Syracuse that she was in by herself at a time in which most women were needing to be chaperoned. She's living on her own and is like, I'm going to be an artist. I could relate to that. Like, I too have moved to a bigger city and thought, I'm going to be an artist. Can you guys talk a little bit about her, about the personal side of her life, being somewhat of a renegade, but also being an obsessor on the material of porcelain?
I mean, she's incredible. And I'm located, 2 hours from here is the Everson Museum, where I am right now. And it's, for all intents and purposes, my local museum. And I do go up there quite a bit to see that work and, learn about her in school, learn about that pot. And the fact that I get to see it whenever I want is kind of incredible. And it was, so it's digging into the research of those stories. Like, I didn't know that about her until I dug into the research, and I've got to say Garth Johnson at the Everson was really great in directing me towards like the key seminal text. So I think there's a lot of folks out there that we're also leaning on for their expertise. And and so there's a couple great, there isn't a really massive biography of her, but there are two books that are kind of edited compilations of by different folks. One included a chapter that was written by Frederick Hurton Reed, who was her contemporary and colleague. And so there's a chapter in there that's written by him about her when I think maybe just after she had passed. So there's some really incredible texts out there that are people from her time and place talking about her and talking about sort of her, certainly in the writings of Samuel Robinson, her husband, Carl Atherton, who was her last studio assistant. There's some really incredible kind of primary research, first accounts of describing her determination, describing of her from the record of all of the ceramic magazines, which are also housed at the Everson. She wrote in almost every single one of those. And you can really when you read those editorials, you can start to see and really hear her voice and maybe her frustrations with the limitations of how she could be an artist as a woman. And, she married a man who saw the world the same way as her. And I think that kind of turning point, like they got married and went to City Hall and opened a business. Right? Which then allowed her this like freedom and agency to proclaim her knowledge to the world and to say to other, artists out there, other young women, to say, you can be more. In fact, it's not just you can be more, you should be more. And I'm expecting you all to elevate the level of your work. And this is how I'm going to teach you. So there's all of these really kind of incredible firsthand anecdotes that are written about her. There's a great account of her going to Alfred to summer school for 2 weeks and just sort of expecting to learn everything she needed to learn. And on one hand, she sort of did. And on the other hand, she figured the rest out, right? She's, making porcelain, sourcing her ingredients from around the country, writing to French potters and saying, tell me all your secrets. And they say, yes. There's just, it's such an incredible vibrancy and, determined attitude of I'm not willing to compromise anything. I'm not willing to not be an artist. I'm not willing to not do a hard thing because it's hard. I'm not willing to not be a parent. I'm not willing to not be a teacher. And she did all of those things in a time when it was extremely difficult for women to have agency in that way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think for me, the other thing, because we know there's a broader context of it was a very powerful moment across a lot of spheres where women decided to break out. And I think the States very much led that. There were suffragettes in the UK, there were suffragettes across Europe, there were different organizations in France and the Netherlands, but it was really in the States where it seemed to me there was a determination for women to gain representation. And ceramic is one of those really powerful instances where Adelaide broke through, and a number of other women as well, and they helped organize. They organized themselves,
and it's part of that rise of art pottery, right? And the Rookwood pottery is established at a similar timeline. Pewabic, Newcomb pottery in New Orleans, and they're all led by women in various capacities, right? Some have male partners to sort of like get through the business side of things or the perception, right, in the field. It's also sort of a little bit at the rise of like the art school, isn't it too, Paul?
Yeah, it certainly is. I think that they had a powerful presence in the pioneer art schools. It was the age of the great world's fairs as well. And the American women were the first ones to build women's pavilions. So they could control the look and what was shown and so forth. So they had some success in the other arts and sciences pavilions, but the first one was Philadelphia, 1876, where women's organizations built their own building and controlled. And it happened again and again and again. And it gave an example to the rest of the world. The World's Fairs across Europe started to feature women's buildings. And a vital moment, I think, for women getting representation on a bigger stage. So,
and then Adelaide goes on to win the World's Fair in Turin, right? Essentially, and with the Scarab Vase, she's the first female potter, female American potter to win that.
She was the first American, I think.
Yeah.
Full stop. First American to win a major prize in Europe. And, it was still a pioneer moment where the Europeans thought the Americans were still, we now look at American art in that period across the arts, and there's some wonderful, greatest. If you look at American painting and American sculpture, American ceramic, but it was not regarded that way in Europe. It was thought to be second class. So to walk away in Italy at a World's Fair with the top prize as an American woman, it's incredible. It's a huge achievement. Yeah.
Well, I also want to explain the timeline of her career. So she starts as a China painter, and that's how she made her living. She was a professional China painter.
And that was a totally acceptable way for women to make work, because you could China paint from your home. You could, I would be fired, and then you could sell those, right? And she had some, and it was a thing that was taught in girls' schools, as a part of sort of learning a trade, or, so, and that's really what it was seen. But that wasn't enough for her. She wanted to be an artist, not just a China painter, because there was sort of a class distinction between a China painter, and because the China painter is just someone applying the design, it's not the person making the design.
So that is, the chronology better, but that's like late 1890s that she is working in China painting. And by 1910 or 1909, whenever she made the Scarab Vase, like, how do you go from that? That's what I was thinking, is like, how do you go from China painter to an expert porcelain maker in 10 years, basically?
Very, very quickly. I mean, she was China painting even out of school. And her family moved all over the place, from all over the Midwest, out to the Dakotas, back to Syracuse, where her father had family. And that's where we find her at like age 24, listed as an artist in the directory. I think it's at that point, or around that point, that her parents separate and ultimately end up divorcing, because her mother couldn't handle the financial instability. And so she's China painting to help support her sister's education. And I think it's actually in the early 90s that she moves to New York City, maybe around 1893, 94. And she goes to study with William Merritt Chase, who's sort of one of the top painters at that time. Yep. She wins some awards painting, but she's still China painting. And in and amongst that sort of living in and around New York City is where she reconnects with Samuel Robineau, her husband, and they get married in 1899, I think. And they relocate back to Syracuse in 1901, like fairly quickly thereafter. And that's when they establish the Ceramic magazine. So she makes this decision when they move to Syracuse that she wants to learn how to work in porcelains. And she writes to Texile Doat, who's the master potter at the Sèvres porcelain manufactory in Paris, and asks for his, how does she make porcelain? And he sent her like this 100-page document, which her husband, Samuel Robineau, was French, so he translated it. And he translated those into sort of chapters, and they published them as articles in Ceramic magazine. So not only is she learning the information, she's disseminating it to this broader field. The first time she touched porcelain was 1901 in the studio of Charles Volkmer I think actually in Princeton, New Jersey. In New Jersey, in his studio. Maybe it was in Princeton. I don't know. She makes this little sort of squat vase bowl sort of thing that has piercings through it and these incredibly detailed carved beetles on it. And it's with this blue glaze. And you can find that object in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. This is the first time she's ever touched porcelain. And that, I think, is like, I think as makers, we can like point to these aha moments, like when something clicks or you figure out like I used to make these teapots where I'd throw all these parts and put them all back together. And it would take me like 2 weeks to make 6 of them. And I loved them, but they were super labor intensive. And then I went and did a watershed residency, and just having time and space to play, I figured out how to make them in 2 days. And it was like, whew, right? I think making this little dumpy beetle thing, I think that's her aha moment. I think that's the moment where like the light bulb goes on. It was like, yeah, this is for me. And so she does it. She like figures that out. She goes and takes this 2-week class. And again, she has a lot of failure, right? There's a lot of an account of failure, which I don't want to gloss over, that she kept coming back to it and kept reworking it. And, at one point she's trying to make these vessels that are so like paper thin, eggshell thin, and they just keep crumbling. She just talks about how they just keep falling apart, and she makes a handful of them. But she's not afraid to push the boundaries of what's possible. But yeah, she somehow goes in that time period, in like literally less than a decade, she becomes this master potter and teacher, and she and Samuel are invited in 1909 to come out and be a part of the team of this new school, University City in St. Louis, where they brought the French potters in, Taxil Doat and 2 other French potters. They brought in Frederick Hurton Reed. They were building this whole school to essentially teach young women, give them applicable trade skills so that they could go be china painters. And that's where she makes that body of work. She sent 50 or so objects to the Turin World's Fair, and she wins for the Scarab Vase, which she spent over 1,000 hours carving.
It's
amazing. Can you imagine? I mean, Ben, can you imagine? Like, can you imagine we could go and get the porcelain from the store. Like, not only becoming like a glaze chemist and a clay body chemist, like turning like wheel throwing porcelain. And I've got to imagine that. I don't know how great that porcelain was, but it's like
couldn't have been great.
No,
it's an incredible story. I think also there's a very interesting philosophical thing that we know there's quite a long tradition of women decorators. Sèvres tended to use women to do the decoration. It's almost as though the production cycle had become gendered. Women didn't make the objects, they decorated. And that was absolutely the case at the end of the 19th century. And she said, nah, I'm going to make the whole thing. There's a politics there. There's a gender politics there so that struggle, I think, is not just because she was an incredibly stubborn, wonderfully committed individual, a fantastic individual, but I think there's a bigger politics of I want to do the whole game. I don't want to be shoved into a bag. I'm not a decorator, I'm an artist. And I think that's the important thing. And of course, traditionally, quite often the decorator is not credited. We've had to do a lot of work to find out who some of them were. So yeah, I think there's a big story there of breaking through.
The other story there too is she had 3 children under the age of 10 while she's making that work. And I'm a parent. Ben, you're a parent. Paul, you're a parent. We're all parents, right? And then trying to juggle the making, the family, the teaching, all of that. And she was doing that then as well. She was like, there's accounts of her like hand making, sewing all of the children's clothing and setting up. She set up for several summers a school for artists in Syracuse at their property, Four Winds. She actually arranged for childcare for working parents, which is like so ahead of her time.
The thing that I love about her that I can relate to as a maker is that also porcelain becomes the muse. Like it becomes the thing she has the relationship with. And so many potters listening to this right now will be like, yeah, I understand that. And in that connection, like that intimate connection to the material must have been how she goes from nothing to
Yeah.
the world's best, and
Right.
arguably one of the most famous American ceramic objects total.
I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I might add, folks, it's pretty much a golden age in American ceramics.
Yeah.
I mean, she's one of the great figures, but she's working at the same time as George Orr, a world changer. And then, Tico pottery, Gruby, those major places producing fantastic levels of design. It's a golden moment, isn't it? We can now see.
Well, actually, I wanted to end our conversation talking about a larger shift from ceramics in the factory model to ceramics in the studio potter model. And they are the transitionary figures,
They are.
Orr and Robineau, and there were a few more. But they're like even Rookwood. Like Rookwood had artists working in the factory. It wasn't like they worked at home and sold the pots through Rookwood.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Orr and Robineau largely did. So can you guys talk about how after that period, everything shifts to the studio potter model, which is how we have been educated, you and I, Stephanie?
Yeah. Well, I think because she ended up, she was teaching in St. Louis as a part of that sort of, teaching women how to make work, but she was hired as the decorator teacher, right? So the French potters were making the pots. Someone was firing the kilns. Someone else was making the clay, sort of the men's work, if you will. But part of what came with that was her own studio. Every single one of those teachers had their own studio so that they could continue making work. And then when that school ended up failing for a series of financial mismanagement in a very short period of time, the Robineaus moved back to Syracuse, and it's not long after that. Maybe it's another decade or so, she's invited to join the faculty at Syracuse University. So I think it's kind of bound up in that space of teacher potter, studio potter, which is really the model that you and I came up on. It's the model that I kind of live right now, that I teach, but I also make and I do all those things myself. But it's like it's such a shift away from the factory design model, and I think the art pottery gave a space for experimentation and pushing of boundaries, and the idea of bringing artists in to work within a factory. That also starts to be this, I think, a transitional point. Where all of a sudden there starts to be the possibility of something new or different, and it's not necessarily an American attitude, but maybe it is driven a little bit because we see British studio pottery happening, in decades later, where there's this shift away from those factory sort of models. But even when you look at the sort of the American attitudes to studio pottery and our colleagues in Europe, you go to a European school and it's really about learning how to become a designer of ceramic, right? And there's a different attitude, and it's not a derogatory description. There's just a different approach that I think comes out of maybe the sort of the moment of possibility and renewal and change that happens in the United States post-Civil War and into the turn of the century.
Yeah, I think the States is incredibly important for art pottery and the growth of that. I agree with everything Stephanie says. I would complicate the picture somewhat. There's
Good.
no doubt that the French were working in the studios as individuals as well. Jean
Yeah.
Carrières, Eugene Delaherche, there was a whole range of them who transitioned ceramic towards the equivalent of being, as it were, a painter. And those people had studios. Now, they also had wider support. In Scandinavia, right up to today, there is handmade studio pottery in the middle of the factories. And a significant number of the production runs coming out of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, started off as studio pots, as prototypes, which were then adjusted into production. So There was no space between, as it were, the hand and design. In some ways, craft and design is an artificial thing we invented into the 20th century so we could have different departments in art schools. It didn't really exist then. In England, likewise, there was manufactories. That is, art pottery came largely out of small, but absolutely multi-person setups, except in some cases, like the Martin brothers, the legendary, slightly bonkers, wonderful equivalents of George Orr. They pretty much ran a studio in the way that we would recognize. But at the same time, British art pottery tended to be made in bigger manufactories. And I think it's in the States, as Stephanie says, where that notion of the individual really develops, I think. But the factory and the individual studio was sort of a bit like that. They overlapped. Apart from the giant factories where millions of things were squirted out every day. That's really a story of the 1920s. But we were getting, in the Stoke-on-Trent and in key areas in the States, Stoke-on-Trent and Written, we were into mass production. And then there's Bernard Leach, lovely Bernard Leach, who leans over all of us, who spent a lot of time in the States with Hamada teaching. He, in a way, puts a tin hat on. He confirms the notion of ceramic as an artist. But absolutely, it was already there in the 1890s. It was there 30 years before, but Leach wrote about it and promoted it and put the Anglo-Japanese angle on it and the American-Japanese angle on it and consolidated. And we tend to think of Leach as being a key figure. He's a key figure for promoting that idea of the ceramic artist. But Adelaide Robineau was already there 30 years before.
And she was already there publishing and promoting those ideas through Ceramic Magazine, and that was where she made her money. From the circulation of that publication. It wasn't from her pots, which is, again, sort of maybe a contemporary story as well.
And I would think Leach made most out of his book, A Potter's Book, than he did out of his pots. Sadly, it's hard work being a potter. Yeah.
Yes. Well, there's also, I think, a technological shift in the American energy system that made at least American small potters possible, which is a stable electric grid. And that is not that old. In fact, when I went to Pewabic years ago, they were working on the very first electric kilns. And I was thinking, well, why didn't electric kilns exist before that? And it's like, well, I don't know if you guys have ever seen knob and tube electricity, but it is dangerous as hell. Like,
super dangerous. It's terrifying.
Want to hook a kiln in your wooden house up to that.
Well, there's this amazing anecdote about Robineau that she had her first kiln was one of the Revelation kilns that were made by the co-founder of Pewabic, I believe. Yeah. Yep. And it was in the basement. So it's run on kerosene. And it was in the basement of her and Robineau's apartment rental. And the moment that they decided they needed to build their own studio with a separate kiln shed was the moment that the floorboards almost caught on fire because all of the fumes from the kerosene started pouring up through the floorboards. And there's this she writes about how they were soaking rags in water and drenching the floor so it would not catch fire. So I'm not sure that they got their deposit back on that one, if there was such a thing at that time period.
Can you imagine that tenant if it was your house? It's a wonderful story.
Well, this has been a real pleasure. Can you just plug, Stephanie, how people can listen to the show?
Yeah. So you can listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. You can search the podcast, but you can also search Heni Talks. That's HENI Talks on YouTube. And they've got a really fantastic channel there, which all of the video versions come out through on a weekly basis. And if you can't find those links, you can follow me on Instagram at Political Potter, and you'll find the link to the podcast in my bio.
Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
I'd like to thank Paul and Stephanie for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with them. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and Kiln Fire. If you're your organization and is interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, I definitely appreciate your support. You can get in touch at talesofAredclayRambler.com. I'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.